Hello again, everybody. I'm here with chapter number 12. This chapter is on new religious traditions, and we need to spend a little time figuring out what that means exactly. The fact is, if you were to look, I think this is something I talked to you about when we dealt with indigenous traditions very early in the semester. If you were to look at a textbook from 15 or 20 years ago and look at this same chapter, it probably wouldn't be called new religious traditions. It probably would have been called cults and sects. And that's what we're talking about here. Small groups, small religions that have formed relatively recently and are not necessarily what we would consider world religions or large world religions or mainstream religions or something like that, but they're still important. They're still well worth talking about, and there's often very interesting things we can learn from these religions. But why don't we call them cults and sects anymore? Because both those words, especially cults, have come to have a real negative sort of connotation associated with them. The word cult, at least as it's defined by your book, and as it's generally accepted by most scholars, it just means a group organized around the worship of something. A person, a god, an idea even could have a cult following. And so most large religions are some sort of cult. Christianity is the cult of Jesus Christ. Buddhism, you could certainly say, is the cult of the Buddha, in certain forms at least. And that would be completely appropriate. Nobody would say that because that's not the way we use the word cult. We use the word cult to mean something bad. If somebody tells you, I just found out my brother-in-law is in a cult, that's a bad thing. That's concern. We need to figure out how to get your brother-in-law out of a cult, that kind of thing. So because those words became so loaded, especially in the 80s, they've just been kind of tossed aside. They're in your vocabulary list. The book explains that they don't mean what we usually use them to mean, but we still recognize that you got to call these religions something else. So we're going to call them new religious traditions, but I'll probably keep referring back to this idea of cults and sects. And one of the things that we need to talk about when we're talking about cults and sects or new religious traditions has to do with the number of them that we see in the world. There's a notion that they may be on the rise, that there may be more cults and sects, more new religious traditions forming now than there ever have been in the past. And we need to look at this a little carefully because this is somewhat interesting. There's a possibility that this is just an illusion, that we think there are more of these in the world today because maybe just there's more people in the world today. So, okay, yes, if we look at the raw numbers, there are more in the world today than there were in the past, but if we look at it as a proportion of how many people there are, it's still the same. 1/10% of all the people in the world form new religions, join cults and sects, or something like that. And it's just a function of population. Or it may be a function of something like media. The fact that today we can see the world in a way that has never been possible before, even as little as 10 or 15 years ago. The kind of access that we have to the world is completely different today. If you want to learn about what people are doing in China this afternoon, you can pull it up on the internet and you can find some relatively good information. You can look at some videos and you can read some blogs in translation and you can do all sorts of things to learn about the world. So it may be that there were always a lot of these little cults and sects and new religious traditions out there. It was just a lot harder for us to find them. And the same kind of thing. This is sort of a real explanation why there might actually be more of these. It may be because we're so much more connected. Because if there are 10 people on the entire world who all want to worship the same weird little thing, they can all find each other now in a way that they couldn't before the internet and before global connectivity existed. So it may be that, yes, there are literally more in the world today. Not because more people are interested in these things, but because more people are able to connect with each other and to really make something out of those interests. That's a possibility too. If it is literally true that today more people are interested in cults and sects and new religious traditions than have ever been interested in the past, that may be something worth looking at too. We know that for a lot of these people, they've been part of larger, more mainstream religious traditions, and they've decided to leave. They've become disenfranchised, they've become disappointed, they've for some reason decided that this no longer is for them. And it may be because they don't feel that it socially or ethically represents their tradition, their values, their beliefs, or it may be that it's too big, it's too bureaucratic. I mean, that's one of the realities of large-scale religions. If you belong to a big religion, there's pretty much 100% guarantee that the leader of that religion is never even going to know whether you're alive or dead, is never going to hear your name in his or her entire life, and isn't going to be impacted by you in any way, nor will you be impacted directly by him or her. And that can be very uncomfortable. It can be a lonely sort of feeling. These new religions are almost always small when they start out, so it may make sense for people seeking a more personal sort of connection with their religious faith to join some small group, some offshoot, some branch. And that, by the way, is one of the things we see very commonly with these traditions, is that they're not created out of nothing. They're not the invention of some person, though some of them are, but that they're an offshoot of an existing tradition. In fact, that's probably the best thing we can do with the rest of this video, is talk a little bit about what kinds of new religious traditions, what kinds of cults and sects we tend to see in the world. And that's one of the things that we see fairly often, what we would call a revival tradition. And a revival tradition, it just means a religion that says, hey, we are reviving the correct original version of religion X. So, say Christian revival traditions. Jehovah's Witnesses are a Christian revival tradition. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which we'll talk about in the second video, are a Christian revival tradition. They're based on this idea that we're not doing something new, we're doing something old. We're going back to the original roots of Christianity, and we're reviving those roots, minus all the nonsense that's been added over the last 2,000 years. And that could go for Buddhist revival traditions, revival movements in Islam, revival movements within Judaism or Hinduism, or anything. Any tradition can have these sorts of things. There are also universalist traditions. And a universalist tradition says that in some important way, all of the people on earth are connected to this same sort of divine message. It may be that they are all worshiping the same being in their different ways. It may be that they are all worshiping something that is completely different from what any of them recognize, but at its core is something that is shared. Unitarian Universalism is a version of this based on Christianity. The Baha'i movement or tradition is a religion that is universalist and comes from Islamic roots. But all universalist traditions share this kind of universal message that we're all in this together, we're all doing the same thing, there's no better or worse religion, so to speak, that we all have this equal ability to know the divine will, to be part of this divine thing, regardless of where we're coming from. There are apocalyptic traditions. Apocalyptic traditions are fairly common when you're talking about small groups like this. You might have, apocalyptic just means interested in the end of the world, warning about the end of the world or something like that. Jehovah's Witnesses, again, they are a Christian revival tradition, but they are also an apocalyptic tradition. They're very focused on the idea that the world is ending relatively soon and that we should behave accordingly and so forth. And that's something I should probably point out. You can certainly have combinations of any of these kinds of traditions I'm talking about. Ecological traditions focused on nature, synergistic traditions focused on trying to combine two existing religions to form something new, extraterrestrial traditions that believe that instead of gods and spirits and so forth, what we really are dealing with are beings that exist in the real world but are not from Earth, that are extraterrestrial. They're aliens instead of angels, sort of thing. And those are relatively uncommon, but certainly something we find as well. We also see there's a lot of nervousness about these new religious traditions. They're very threatening to existing traditions, and that makes sense. They're weird, they're scary. All religions, anything we've studied, has some sort of weird, unusual, bizarre stuff that they talk about. So whenever somebody comes up with new, weird, unusual, bizarre stuff to talk about, in the case of these new religious traditions, it's always going to be off-putting to other people. It's always going to seem out of whack with the norms. Alright, well I'm going to leave it there for video number 1, and I'll come back to you with video number 2, and we'll start talking about a couple specific religions. See you there.